Hello, I'm Donald McCauley and welcome to this Medics Voices conversation. I'm talking to Felicity Goodyear-Smith, who is normally in New Zealand, but today we're in Dublin. So we are very welcome. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Felicity, you've had a most remarkable career. But let's take you back to the very beginning. Were you always a dynamic campaigner?
Oh, I wouldn't have called myself a dynamic campaigner. I've always been quite enthusiastic about things.
So tell us back to your school days. Were you a leader at school?
No, but I was sort of top at school. I was a conscientious student. I think I've changed over the years, but I was probably fairly quiet.
And then on to medical school. Tell us about medical school.
Well, medical school, I finally started to have a whole lot of fun. And I realised at medical school, I only really had to do enough to pass. So it was the first time I hadn't sort of topped the class by any means. I just realised that I could have a bit more of a social life as well. And as long as I got through and I learned enough.
So after medical school, you've done some very exciting jobs. So tell us about them.
I guess my last year at medical school, I did an elective up in a place called the Hokianga in North New Zealand. And I ended up being the acting superintendent because the only other doctor there got meningitis and I had to ship him off to the city. So I had about probably 3 weeks where I was the only doctor there, and I was a little hospital, and we had about 9 health clinics that were run by nurses, and I'd have to drive to each one, sometimes across a ferry, across the harbour, and it was a very valuable experience for me, and I don't think I did anything too disastrous. I used to ring the medical superintendent in the city at night to tell him what I'd done and what was happening. So I think it gave me a lot of confidence.
Well, then you brought that confidence onto the high seas, I believe.
Oh, you mean I did work on a ship. I was trying to work my passage to England, and it didn't work out. But I ended up having a couple of months on a cruise, which actually financed my trip to England subsequently.
And you were in Jamaica.
Yes. Well, before that, I actually did. I spent some time in London. And I did a whole lot of hospital locums. And then I got offered this locum in South Wales for 3 months. And so I went to South Wales, and I was in this little village called Blaenwimby, and sharing care with the doctor in the next village. And he was truly inspirational. So I used to go and see him and his wife. He taught me, and you'll guess who it is now, because he taught me that the people who needed the care most got the least. I had no idea how famous he was until many years later, but Julian inspired me, and then I went to Jamaica on the basis of that because I saw that it was a place that had a need, and also I liked reggae music, and it was and I wanted a hot climate after a winter in London.
So what did you do after that?
After that, I went back to New Zealand, and I worked as a very busy GP in an inner city suburb that was really the slums of Auckland, but was becoming rapidly gentrified. And so it was a very interesting mix, ethnically, socio-demographically. It had lots of artists, the gay community. So it was a fascinating place to work, but it was also the time when you did your own call 1 and 3, delivering babies, being a police doctor. So it was pretty full on for a few years. It was sort of very satisfying type of general practice.
Well, let's move on to an area that's a particular interest of yours, and that's when you started in prison medicine.
Oh, well, I actually started being on the police roster at that point. And I subsequently did locums in the prison. So but I was never a sort of a prison doctor. I was just covering for other people. But I worked in several different prisons, and I also then worked in the city mission, which was actually a very similar population. In fact, I mean, often there was the revolving door people who are homeless and very socially deprived, ending up back in prison and coming out again.
Well, then you moved on to an interest, and that was in sexual assault. Tell us how
Uh,
this
well,
became.
the sexual assault work was the police doctor work I did when I was in Freeman's Bay in this inner city area, and they hadn't really had any doctors um, experienced in doing sexual assault examinations. They had a male roster completely. So I set up a female roster. I was invited to do so, and I got us trained with various forensics and STIs, and we started to do the on-call sexual assault work. And I wrote a textbook about that on how to do the examinations. Um, Subsequently, after I sold my Freeman's Bay practice and I moved off that roster, I actually started to see lots of people who were suffering from false allegations. So I started to see that that we needed to deal with true allegations, but we also needed to not make the net so wide that we captured people who, that we interpreted things in children, for instance, or in women who are recovering memories, and to absolutely believe everything without having a critical eye.
Well, let's delve a little deeper into that. Tell me more about this interest, and which became a very passionate interest in the false allegations.
Yes, it didn't make me popular. I was probably the only one in New Zealand who was speaking out about it, and particularly this was an era where there was a whole hysteria about recovered memories, and therapists were inadvertently uh, they expected that their women clients uh, um, the cause for their anorexia or their depression or their marriage breakup was that they'd been sexually abused as a child in their home. And the sort of demand characteristics and the hypnosis that they used mean that these women came up with memories that were largely not true. And often they'd come up with having been quite bizarre things like satanic ritual abuse that was happening. It would be happening every day in their home, and then they'd forget it and it would happen again. And they only then recovered it in therapy many years later. And there was an implicit, we must always believe them. And so it did a lot of damage. It did a lot of damage to the women, and it did a lot of damage to the families. And they'd break off contact, or the father would go through a court process. Never convicted actually in New Zealand. But there was also the cases of children being inappropriately interviewed, and suggestive interviewing where children, little tiny children, would come up with things that were very unlikely to have happened or hadn't happened, and again implicitly just believed without any critical eye. And so my view was that yes, sexual abuse clearly happens, it's terrible, but we need to be very sure that we're not also accepting that false allegations can happen too. And the mantra at that time was that women and children never lie about abuse. So there wasn't a recognition that, well, actually they're not lying. They've come to believe something that's happened that hasn't happened.
Well, you did some medical research in that context, which was about gonorrhea in children.
Oh yes, well that was a bit later, but yes, I did. I started working for the defence in very selected cases where I thought the evidence was overwhelming that this person could not be found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And I saw this little girl who, a baby, a case where the parents were Pacific Islanders, poor, living in very crowded conditions, and that the parents had gonorrhea, and the father admitted he'd brought it into the relationship. And the little girl had a discharge baby, took her to the hospital. They said she must have been sexually abused by one or the other. And at that point I thought, well, that's the only way you can get it. So I better just check. So I started to do a review of the literature, and the more I looked, the more I found. And I found that yes, gonorrhea is sexually transmitted, but there are many ways in which it can be non-sexually transmitted um, uh, by um, by fomites, by hands, by towels. And in this case, the most likely thing was that the mother often didn't have nappies, and so she would use her sarong, and with it, she already had her own discharge. So it seemed very likely that this child was that actually neither the mother or the father had sexually abused her. We never will know, but looking at the situations, uh, but there was a family court hearing in that case. They didn't charge the parents, but they took the child off the parents. So the child lost her parents, and I thought that was really really sad. And I thought the chances of this actually being sexual abuse of a 1-year-old baby with no other physical findings, the fact that she had, she had a permanent discharge, no other physical findings at all. I thought that was extremely unlikely, but I'm still probably the sole voice just about in the whole world that actually says um, that when you get a prepubertal girl with gonorrhea, there's a very high chance that it's non-sexually transmitted. And all the guidelines here in the UK and New Zealand, US, they all say that uh, non-sexual transmission cannot happen, despite the huge body of evidence, all sorts of evidence to show that it can and it does. Um, these regularly men are going to prison on the basis of this, and children are losing their parents.
Well, I guess this work, the two bodies of work, brought you on and stimulated your interest in the inequalities. Particularly, you're an advocate for men's health and how men have been perhaps wrongly chastised in some ways.
Well, I don't know so much as that. I'm an advocate for people's health, and I don't think we should be singling out. I mean, I think everybody, who has a need. I mean, getting back to Julian, where there's a need, then you should be entitled to health care, and you shouldn't be, uh, you shouldn't give all the resources to one group where there's another group that also have a need. So, um, I mean, women's health, clearly there's a whole lot of things that are only that only women have, but there are also some other diseases that only men have. So it's not that I'm an advocate for one or the other. I just think that we should be looking after uh, providing healthcare for people who need it. Really.
Let's move on to your academic work
Yeah.
now, because you're a very senior academic. Tell us about your transition into the academic work.
I actually started to. I was working in my full-time practice, and then I met my husband, or husband to be, and I decided I couldn't. I had no space in my life at all, so I sold my practice. I had to make some room, and I started to do locum work, and I got a small research grant. It was actually uh, uh, to do some evaluation of the many cases I'd seen about false allegations. So that was sort of the first bit of research. It was a health research council, and it ended up being I ended up doing a master's after that, and then I started to get some contract work, mainly doing systematic reviews for accident compensation. But I started to pick up little bits of research, and I did that on contract or just putting out grant applications and from 2000 to 2010, and then. I'd done so much research, and I also did some online teaching. It was very early days, but we had the Goodfellow unit used to provide CME, and I used to provide material for that. It was often on CD-ROMs, of course, um, and um, and then I was encouraged to apply for a chair, and I applied for a chair in 2010, and I got it. And so suddenly I was a full-time academic and just doing some general practice on the side, really. Mostly research, not a lot of teaching, really. I've been predominantly research.
Well, tell us about your research, because you've done a number of different research works.
So I have quite a few strands. I've done quite a lot of mental health and lifestyle. I developed an online tool called ECHAT, Case Finding and Help Assessment Tool, and it was originally a paper tool. It's now an online tool, and it's now a youth version, and it's now being used quite a lot in New Zealand. It asks a lot of questions about mental health and lifestyle. But for each one, if the person says yes, there's a help question. Is there something with which you'd like help? And the answer is yes today or later. And it's a clinical tool, so you do it before you have the consultation. With young people, it's often before they see a nurse, and so it alerts the nurse to what the young person wants to address. Maybe they say, yes, I smoke, but I don't want to do anything about it. They can still do a brief intervention and say, well, I see you smoke. When you're ready, there are things I can talk with you about it. So yeah, that's a whole big body of work. Done quite a lot of international work on primary health care in various ways. So I was the international chair of NAPCRG, of the committee there, and also the WONCA Working Party on research. So those sort of dovetailed. And so I've had a lot of international colleagues that I've worked with over the years, and that's been amazingly rewarding. I've been very blessed.
So let's bring you up to your most recent piece of work, and that is the WONCA Research Project. Tell us about that.
You mean the core values one? Yeah. Yes. Well, that's a project I'm working with Anna Stavdal and Johann Sigurdsson from Norway and Iceland. So Anna was the president of WONCA. She's the immediate past president, and this was her project. And the three of us are the steering committee. We have regional leaders from each of the 7 regions of the world, and they each have their own teams. And we're looking at exploring what are the core values of our discipline of family medicine. Anna has already done it in the Nordic region, and it's been pretty much taken up as the European model of what are the core values. But are these the same things for our colleagues in more developing countries, across the world? So we've got a book contract with Taylor and Francis with they've got a WONCA Family Medicine series, and we're meeting at this conference. Each of the regions are actually running workshops at their regional conferences. Each of the regions will be writing their own chapter, and then we have a chapter at the beginning on what are values generally, what are principles, what are attributes, and then the whole journey of this project, which started quite a long time ago when Anna first started looking at it just in Norway, and then then there'll be well, what is the do we have a consensus on, or do we have a lot of diversity? How useful are these concepts in different contexts? Because WONCA is an organisation of family doctors, but family medicine is practiced very differently in different parts of the world. So that's one of my current projects at the moment that I'm really enjoying.
Felicity, it's just fascinating listening to you. As I described you as a dynamic leader at the beginning, and you certainly are. And we're talking to you today just as part of a 3-month world tour, and we look forward to hearing the results of that again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John.